John, how you doing? It's great to have you on the show.
Great, guys. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, so for those who are just kind of tuning in to the show, maybe haven't heard an episode yet, this is the Founder Hour where we talk with founders like yourself and share their stories and sort of all the things that they've picked up, throughout their journey. And so where we like to always start is from the very, very beginning to give some context. So kind of give us a little bit of a rundown of, where you grew up and what young John was like.
Oh, wow. So we're going way back. We're going
way back.
Old school. So sure. I grew up in a village called Rural Ridge, Pennsylvania. Literally, the word rural was in the first half of the name. That's how rural it was. Middle of nowhere in the hills of Pennsylvania, about 300 residents. I like to joke, but it's not that a joke. I was related to like 20-25% of the village. My grandfather immigrated here, was like the foreman of the coal mine, and sort of when that shut down was sort of the de facto mayor of this little tiny village. Got bused to school an hour each way in high school, over to a pretty good public school in the suburbs of Pittsburgh called Fox Chapel. But childhood there was great. It was, we had a lot of land, a lot of hills, a lot of outdoor adventures in nature. And I was a very, creative child. I liked to create stories, build things out in the woods, do sort of big adventures with my brain and my body. And I played a lot of sports. I played competitive soccer up to the Olympic development level. And was always very driven, very excited to sort of compete in the game of life, right? Whether that was school or sports or, academic things or whatever it might be, always sort of wanted to be the best at whatever it was that I could be.
John, what did your parents do?
My father was a public school teacher. Elementary school for most of it was high school before I was born, and then elementary school for most of my life growing up. And my mom was stay at home until probably I was in high school, and then she went back into the workforce. She did technical sales work for sort of the second half of her career. She was a school teacher as well before having my sisters and I, where she took a break for a couple decades. So a pretty, middle sort of the road income home. In our little village, I think we were considered wealthy because there was, there was a salary from a public school district. I think in the broader scheme of things, lower middle class.
Yeah. And like growing up in such a small town, I mean, were you ever exposed to anyone who had quote unquote like made it, like, kind of maybe got out, did something big in the world and where you're just like, I want to be like that, just like that ambition? Or was that like something that you had in you?
Yeah, so I would say not in my little village. There was definitely nobody living there who sort of made it. People that made it didn't live in Rural Ridge, Pennsylvania, such a small town. But the school district I got bused to, just because I got lucky to live within the borders, really, that was a district where, Bill Cower's kids went to school there. And executives for large corporations in the greater Pittsburgh area went there. Different players for the Penguins over the years. The general manager of the Penguins, Craig Patrick, his son CJ, went to school with me in middle school and in high school. So I got exposed, to folks who had varying levels of success through primarily the high school sort of age, but in the more middle school, junior high, and up, not elementary school, where I was more out with sort of my compatriots out in the deep suburbs.
Yeah, and having a parent who was a school teacher, was there like a lot of pressure to do really well in school? I think I saw you were valedictorian of your high school, so you must have done pretty well. But was there like a lot of pressure on you, or not really?
Yeah, not from them, all from me. They definitely, had the rhetoric with my sisters and I that school was important, that we were all going to go to college, that was an important way to sort of change your future, and it was sort of an expectation. But almost all the pressure that I had I got my first non-A grade as a sophomore in college. And it was sort of all internally driven. I just wanted to be great at stuff. And school was, part of that for me.
Did you have an idea of what you wanted to pursue in college?
Not really. When I got to Notre Dame, I honestly looked at the sort of list of options and I said, what is the easiest major for the highest starting average salary? It was a very ROI based calculation because I didn't want to just do the academics. I wanted to do all the other stuff when I was in school. And to me, all that was just as important. So finance was my major. I think it was a fine foundation for what I ended up doing. Not necessarily at the time a strategic choice in terms of I know that this is what I want to do with my life. Much more practical. And I sort of fell into during my education this track of sort of investment banking or equity something, but much more from sort of the investor angle, where Notre Dame had a really strong program called Applied Investment Management, which sent a lot of bankers to Wall Street. It was sort of a tried and true method. As I got deeper into that process, though, also got exposed to more of the Bain, the McKinsey, the BCG consulting side of things. And that really sort of piqued my interest a lot more as a senior, and ended up being what I did, post-graduation.
And you mentioned, wanting to do it all, like in college, besides just the academics. Like, what else were you involved in on campus?
Yeah, so really engaged in a lot of things at different times, different things. So I was in the Notre Dame Glee Club. I was also on the Notre Dame football team for an off season. I was a walk-on kicker. I was on the Notre Dame soccer team when I first got there for all of about 2 weeks before I got cut. So played a lot of club soccer while I was there. I was in student council effectively. As a junior and a senior, I was in Bengal Bouqs, which is the boxing club. Raises hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for missions in Bangladesh. And so boxed for a couple years. I just sort of tried to do all the things, and it's kind of generally how I've lived my life, both before and after college. Is sort of, to me, you have one go round here, and why not make the most of it and sort of experience as much of life as you can. And so just a lot of a little, right? I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a specialist. I very much appreciate and I'm amazed by people who can go deep into a subject and dedicate their life to it, right? If you're an economics professor, or you're a figure skater, or whatever you are, if you're like real deep and narrow, I'm amazed by you, but I don't understand you. My brain does not work that way.
You and me both. And I'm just curious for yourself, like, has that ever been a struggle, like growing up or like throughout your life, in terms of, having so many different things, going on at once, and having maybe perhaps a lot of interests, like, and maybe not having, I don't know, a sense of direction, or knowing exactly like what path you want to go down, and just trying a bunch of things, but not really getting too deep into one particular thing?
Yeah, I thrive on that. I actually really think that's super fun. So for me personally, it was never really a struggle, but for my parents, it was absolutely a struggle, because I would need to be 3 places on the same night after school, with no driver's license. I also want to play on this team, Mom. I also want to do this thing, Dad. I'm going to be in this play as well. Like, it was just hard to sort of schedule my life because there was just so much going on all the time. I think from a career perspective, it does create a little bit of a tougher journey, because you don't really fit in a box, right? Like, everybody wants a resume that says, I'm really good at trading bonds, right? Like, that's what I do. You look at my time and my career and my education, there's not a clear thread that says this is what John's great at. So, at different points along the way, it's sort of like, well, wait, where does this guy fit? But for a founder, it was actually great, because I'm pretty good at all the stuff. I'm not great at any one thing. And what do you have to be a founder? You have to be pretty good at a lot of stuff, right? You have to be able to figure out the marketing and the operations and the financing and the all the different pieces well enough to get the company going, right? That's the entire sort of beginning of the journey. So it's a blessing.
But before you started Bouqs, like, even in your earlier career, like, how did you realize or know that you were good at all those different things? Because I mean, working in like certain companies or in consulting, like, you get exposure to all these things, but I feel like until you actually do it and start a business, like, you don't really get that hands-on exact experience. Maybe I'm wrong, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but how did you like come to that realization of like, I'm good at all these different things that is required to build a successful business? Like, maybe I should just go out and do it on my own.
Yeah, it wasn't my realization that I thought I could do it that made me start a company at all. I had good exposure to things at Bain Company, and then I worked in advertising for about 2 years before I came out here, got my MBA at Anderson, and then worked at Disney for about 6-7 years in corporate strategy. Each of those stops had this sort of broad mandate of like, hey, we see the world at the sort of very top level, but it was also narrower than building a business, right? I had almost no operational responsibility for anything over that decade plus of experience. And so it was very different. For me, the need to sort of start a company came from, call it a desire to go from the consultant. Even at Disney, I was effectively an internal consultant, to the doer, to the decision maker, right? I would work on a project for 3 or 4 months. We would go to ultimately the business unit owner, whether it was a client or it was with a Disney, whatever it is, and we would say, here's our perspective on everything that we see, and then they would go make decisions on it. And I always felt a little bit unfulfilled at that moment, kind of like, if they don't make this decision, I'm going to be really frustrated because I would make it this way, right? And I really had this itch to be the one making the decisions. I ran around the Walt Disney Company for 5 or 6 months, sort of trying to find a job where I could do that. And the answer was there was none. I was the closest to the decision making I could be at that stage of my career. And so the answer was, no one here, and rightfully so, is going to give me a division of Disney to run when you're 29 or whatever I was. And so how do I get that ability? I'm going to start a company so I can make the decisions. And that was really sort of the impetus for me getting going.
So I'm curious, knowing what you know now and having the experiences that you've had, if you were to go back, would you want to become a specialist?
No way. It's so against who I am as a person. I think it'd be easier in some ways to build a career and a path, right? If you did finance at this company and that company makes these widgets, the other company that makes those widgets is going to want you to do finance there. It's a pretty clear path, right? Or if you're like a marketing guru and what you love is marketing, you can kind of work your way up and have success. And then you get to a level and you're sort of off to the races. In a lot of ways, it's easier, but it would be completely unfulfilling for me, right? I need something where this broader skill set is rewarded. And actually the idea that you can be creative within it is the point. It's not some other thing where, I need you to be really great at skill number 3, 4, and 5. But really, I need you to bring this breadth of experience to these problems that I'm trying to solve. Because ultimately what I love and what I think I'm good at is sort of seeing the forest for the trees, being really creative around just solving problems, and then getting momentum and effort behind those with a set of resources. Like that's my superpower, and telling that story along the way. And so, being a specialist just wouldn't satisfy those needs for me.
I know internally you had this kind of desire to be in the position of like a decision maker, but externally, like, would you say, you were a pretty good employee, or did you often clash with, I don't know, upper management or like people within the companies that you were working in?
Yeah, I was a pretty good employee. I think my boss at Disney, Bonnie Madison, she's still a really good friend, would say I was a good employee. But behind closed doors with her and previously at Bain Company, I would sort of let it rip, right? I would talk about what I really think we should do here. And often that wouldn't have been politically well received at the upper levels. So I would give my opinion, but I'd give it to like her behind closed doors, right? So that need was there, that like feeling of like, hey guys, we should really just go this way, right? We should obviously do this. But I kind of kept it in check, because in an organization like that, you kind of have to play the game, right? You have to behave a certain way within a set of norms. So I didn't let my sort of internal founder out to be a crazy man within the Walt Disney Company or Bain or any of those places, but I felt myself kind of holding it back. And that was really one of those, again, that need to get out there and make it happen is really why the company started to form in my mind.
But had you stayed, like, did you not feel like you had a path to get to that point, to be and eventually like in a seat that you were sort of making larger decisions, or was there a path you just didn't want to do it? Like, you don't want to go down that
Yeah, I think it was more the latter. I think the path might have been there, but one, it would have been too slow. And two, I was in that job for almost 7 years, and any consulting job within any organization after 7 years starts to kind of repeat itself. And my need for constantly new stimulation just wasn't being met. So I probably could have hung out and gotten there eventually, but it wasn't being fast enough, and I would have been pretty bored along the way. And boredom to me is the worst thing, right? Like anything but boredom.
And were you someone that throughout all that time, maybe even back to college or before, like, came up with different business ideas constantly, or did it just hit you out one day where you're like, you know what, I'm not going down this like corporate path. I want to be an entrepreneur, and now I'm going to start, coming up with ideas. Like, was it like a more of a long process for you, like throughout your life, or just more sudden?
Yeah, I kind of always had sort of little side hustles, little projects. I thought of it as more of my creative outlet than necessarily businesses. I produced some things, did some music stuff, was in a couple bands. I had some business plans that I developed at different points, one in business school, one after business school, another one after business school. And it was always sort of dabbling. but because of I'm a really weird profile for a founder. I have a certain level of risk aversion. I get this from my parents. Like, my mom is very conservative. Like, put the money in the bank, save it up, do a good job, buy a house, like do the thing. And my dad's always been like the crazy dreamer thinker guy who's like, what if I could do this? What if I could do that? And so I'm sort of a mishmash of the two, where I had this desire to go out and try big things, but a little bit of a conservatism in me where I was not really ready to go and make that my job. That seemed like too big of a leap. So often these things ended up as sort of side projects that were fun and interesting and kept my brain going, but weren't necessarily all that lucrative. I might make a couple $1,000s here, $10,000 there, but nothing that was a big deal. And then while I was at Disney, I started formulating some of these kind of nights and weekends, saying, "Hey, this thing here could be a business. What would that look like?" And then my co-founder and I for Bouqs sort of started talking about it. And I'd just left Disney to go to a startup, because sort of my journey was, I'm not going to jump straight into something in my garage with 2 people and no income. Let me try something at a relatively established startup, Series C company called ShoeDazzle at the time, and see if I love it, or if its itch is scratched, right, via that kind of a journey. And I fell in love with it within the first week. The pace of change, the decisions being made, having the ability to make those decisions and make them quickly was somewhat addictive for me.
Did you have like a personal purpose, whether you during the time you were at Disney or ShoeDazzle, like something beyond work that you aspired to or for, that you were working towards?
I mean, nothing particular, other than wanting to feel completely fulfilled every day of my job, right? Like, where I could feel like I could bring my full self and it would be rewarded, instead of having to kind of only give parts of me. Like, that was sort of the underlying need that I had. I always loved being in front of crowds. I was in bands, like I said earlier. I was in the different clubs that put me up on stage, blah, blah, blah. I always liked telling stories. I wanted a job where I could do that, and people would actually need me to do that to be successful, right? Instead of sort of tamping it down to play more of the corporate game. And so that was really the underlying need. There wasn't some other external force or anything like that.
So I'm sure like a lot of people probably have a similar goal or desire that you and many other, obviously, current and past and future founders have. But, if you were to kind of think about, you as you, John, and, having this, personal mission of, I want to make sure that I feel fulfilled by the work that I do, would there have been an expiration date if it didn't work out? Like, where you're like, you know what? I keep trying. It's not working. I gave it all I could, but I need to make money, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it's easy to be a dreamer, and it's easy to have all these great ideas. And sure, there's the ones that end up working out, thankfully for you it did. But for majority of people, it doesn't. Like, that's kind of the reality, right? Like, I think after many years, Pat and I have been doing this now for 5 years, we'd like to give the full story. For a lot of people, even for some of them that we have interviewed, it ended up not working out. And so what would you have done, or at what point would you have stopped?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, for any one person there, it's all sort of driven by your individual circumstances, right? If you're 22 years old and you can live in your parents' basement rent free, mom's cooking the meals, you've got a long runway, right? I was, in my early 30s. I had a baby. He was 9 months old when I left my company to start Bouqs. We had a mortgage. We just bought a house, and my wife worked in public education, right? So we had a pretty narrow runway for this to either work or not. And she and I, before I left my paying job to do this, had a pretty explicit conversation around, we have to see progress being made here towards an eventual salary that is livable for us, or we do have to shut it down, right? It can become a hobby, but it's not just me here, right? I got a kid, I got a house, I got a wife.
Can you run us through that conversation? Because I'm curious, because I'm sure a lot of people are probably going to have this conversation at one point, or, should have this conversation, whether with themselves, their partner, their family, whatever. Like, I'm just curious of how that conversation went.
Yeah. So we talked about it pretty explicitly in sort of the plan, and my ask to her was, I just want a shot to bet on me and see if this really can land in the way that I think it can. Because all these years I've been dreaming about it, thinking about it, but I've not given it a real shot. So I want to go and just see what happens. And if it is miserable and there's like no chance of success, or it's going to take 3 or 5 years, I'll go get a job, no problem. Like, I'm not going to put all the financial burden on you forever. Like, we're going to have a defined time frame. And she was super supportive for that, and God bless her, she was very much behind me on giving that a shot, but it was to an extent. And so I left my job in, I think, September, October of 2012. And effectively we said the first check-in is going to be the end of the year. Like, if we launch this thing and we do $2,000 of sales in our first week, and it's January of next year, 3 months later, and it's still $2,000 a week, that's a problem, right? If we're not seeing it move up into the right in the way that we need it to give us confidence that there's going to be something on the other side, I'm going to go get a job in January. We got to January, we were doing like $50,000 a month in revenue. The first month we did like 6 or 8. We were on the right path. So we got to January, we said, okay, next milestone. We've got to raise some money for this thing because I'm making $0 in salary, and it's not a large enough business yet for me to pay myself anything. We're plowing it all right back into the company. So let's see if I can raise $500,000 or more before March. We'll keep going. In March, I got a commitment for $250,000. It wasn't quite the half, but we're kind of like, oh, we're on the way. And so we gave it another, like, almost like a monthly extension for a bit to say, are we getting there on the fundraise? We ended up raising $1.1 million in our seed round. I was able to pay myself a salary. It was half of what I paid myself, or I made at Disney, but it was a salary. It was all of a sudden we had some positive cash flow going. And then it was sort of like, okay, can we get to the Series A? And each step along the way, it was just another conversation until we got to a point where we were so large, it was clearly going to work, at least for some period of time. And then we kind of, took a breath and said, all right, this thing's going to be a journey for a while.
Right.
Yeah. And you mentioned like everyone's circumstance is different. And you talk about one of the sort of desires for you being that you wanted to be kind of like in a leadership position, making decisions and that kind of stuff, which I'm sure maybe you got that when you were working at ShoeDazzle or at a startup, or maybe not, but like that's something that you could get working at a startup, and you can get paid really well. And hopefully if that startup ends up being successful and exiting or going public or whatever, you can make a lot of money. But like, why did you decide I'm going to, because starting a business, like Posh mentioned, it's not always fun and games, and it's a very tough thing to do because there's just so much struggle that comes along with that, whether it's building a company, hiring and firing and managing people. And I mean, your whole livelihood is sort of based on that. And so why decide, to leave ShoeDazzle when you're at this you're getting the startup experience, you're being in that position where you're making decisions to go out and do something on your own?
Yeah. I mean, I think, as far as the timing went, it was sort of a perfect storm of, we were just getting the business launched. It had a lot of sort of excitement in that moment, right? I didn't think I could keep it going sort of as a side project anymore. It was sort of like a hobby. It was nights and weekends at first. While I had a full-time job, I went to my bosses and was like, hey, I have this idea. Is it cool if I do it, on the side? And they were very supportive. Really great team there. But it was getting to a point where like I almost couldn't anymore. There wasn't enough hours in the day. We were about to launch. And then the other part was really, I just had strong conviction that this was the right idea, right? That this was going to work, that we had an insight and a capability that was going to change the way that customers viewed this category. And so I just had a lot of conviction around it. And I felt like if I didn't go all the way, it was going to die on the vine for some reason, right? If I wasn't all in, then others wouldn't be all in. If I wasn't there at 3 a.m. to work on the thing because I had to wake up the next day to go to my day job, I wasn't going to be fully into this thing, and therefore it wasn't going to work. And so it was a little bit of a leap of faith, but mostly I wasn't willing to kind of slow it down or to inhibit the potential it had because of my personal schedule.
Yeah. So I guess let's take it back a little bit to like how the idea even came about. Cause ideas are literally a dime a dozen, right? Like you can sit around and just come up with ideas all day, but there's also this other piece of it of, do I care enough about this problem or this industry or this business to do this for the next foreseeable future? I mean, 10 years, 15 years, whatever, because it takes a while to build a business. And so how did it come about, and like what gave you the conviction of this is what I want to be doing?
Yeah. So my co-founder, JP, and I, we spent, 3 or 4 months talking about it before we literally lifted a finger to do anything. It was sort of just examining the industry, examining the issues, and understanding whether we thought we had a thesis that was sort of supportable. every time we went out and tested that thesis, we got feedback that said, you guys are on the right track. We talked to customers, talked to wholesalers, talked to farmers. We just sort of investigated the heck out of the industry. And every time we came back going, this would make this better, this would make this better, this would make this better. So we were getting a lot of validation from the market saying, hey, this thing could have some legs, right? For me, where I got, sort of uniquely excited was we were bringing something to this space that is pretty rare, right? Agricultural spaces don't tend to be super technologically and especially software heavy. There's lots of big businesses built in that space. I'm not saying there aren't, but on the margin, you get a lot more technology and sciences and biotech and all the other things than you get in flower farming, right? So we had a novel approach as well, and that was really interesting and exciting to me. And then as a brand guy, I looked out at the space. It's $100 billion globally. It's $18 billion in the US. It's a really big market. And it was so weird to me that there wasn't sort of the large aspirational premium brand that you have in every other category. It made no sense. As a brand guy from Disney, it was like, whatever, motorcycles, Harley, coffee, Starbucks. You can go through every other consumer category and name the brand. In flowers, you can't. And people would say, oh, 1-800-Flowers. 70-some% of 1-800-Flowers revenue is not flowers. They're not a flower company. They are a asset-light gifting platform. And so to me, it was sort of like there's this, the opportunity was almost too big to not go after it. It was like, how can this be with $18 billion? This brand doesn't exist. Let's go build it. So the conviction came from a lot of time researching it and sort of getting validation. My co-founder's insights on that side were absolutely crucial because he was from the industry as a flower farmer at the time. And then just this big gap really made it sort of hard to resist.
So I'm not sure if you could actually answer this question or not, but I'm a pretty brutally honest guy and I just ask everything like that comes to my head. Do you actually give a shit about flowers at that point in time, or did you just see it as an opportunity?
Yeah, so I would say it's both. So I didn't grow up like my co-founder living and playing and working and playing on a flower farm, right?
Yep.
Flower farming and the industry is in his blood, literally, like familial generations.
Right.
For him, the flowers are the point. For me, flowers had played sort of critical roles at different moments in my life where I sort of saw the power that the product could have in the world and was very influenced by it. Like I have a rose back here on my shelf from my grandmother's wedding. She and I were really close. Not wedding, sorry, funeral. She and I were really close. I've kept that flower since I was 17 years old. Carried it with me everywhere, right? So the product has personal meaning to me, but that's like almost secondary to what I saw was a really interesting problem to solve. And so I can get behind what we're doing because I believe in it. But in my heart of hearts, why did I want to start the company? It wasn't because of that. It was because this was a fantastic problem to try to solve.
Right. And I mean, the point I was trying to make is like, and that's a great answer, but a lot of folks, I feel like, the narrative is always, pursue your passion, right? And like, I find it hard to believe that, except for your co-founder who grew up around flowers, like that anybody's like waking up every day and constantly thinking about fucking flowers. Like, it's just not the case. Like I drink water every day, but I'm not like, I'm obsessed with the water. I have to start a water brand like every fucking founder out there that has a water brand, right? So, at what point, I guess, do you say it's not necessarily about the passion of the product? I just really believe in this opportunity. Like I could grow to love it, right? Like I could grow to like I'm in commercial real estate. There's nothing to be passionate about, 4 walls and a roof. But like you get to like the industry and the benefits that it comes with and the people there, right? So I guess what are your thoughts on that for people that want to become founders or entrepreneurs or whatever?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that I did have passion for the product, but it wasn't the primary driver.
Right.
Right. And to be honest, I have passion about a lot of things because I'm just interested in things in the world. Like I could probably start 30 companies that are completely, I'm super interested in HVAC right now. It makes no sense, right? It's HVAC. It's the like least interesting in the world, but there are problems in the way the HVAC industry works that I find fascinating. Right. And so it really depends, I think, on your sort of makeup. What I think people do too often is they go, I really love insert thing. And so they go, that's my passion. So therefore I have to build a company in insert thing, right? Whatever it is. And unfortunately, you might be loving something where there isn't a super compelling problem to solve, or you're incapable of solving that problem. So you're banging your head against the wall trying to figure out how to build a new toy for 7-year-olds. And either you don't have the capability or there really isn't a problem to be solved.
Right.
And so too often, and that's the other thing, forget about even starting companies. People go, oh man, I really love music. I'm going to be a CPA for Universal Records. And it's like, you're doing accounting. Like you're not doing music. Find another way to satisfy that passion and get a job that really makes your brain work. Right. And I think that's where too often the subject matter gets too much play when really it's about what makes your brain happy. Right. Like for me, it's really big, wide, disparate problems that need a little bit of a touch to figure out a solution. For somebody else, it might be more specialization, or it might be marketing, or it might be engineering, whatever it might be. Finding a way to understand yourself well enough to say, how often will my brain fire in a happy way if I do this, is really the problem you're trying to solve from a career perspective.
Right. You know, something we hear a lot, especially like from VCs or investors, is having this like founder market fit, right? Like, is the founder someone who really knows something deeply about an industry, has connections, has some leg up, right? Like they're starting at level 5 when someone else would start at level 0, right? And it makes sense. I mean, it's a strategic way to start a business because you have something to start with. And obviously, you being someone who is like more of a generalist and having all these different interests and passions, this is kind of the thing that is, I feel like, a little bit difficult, but you kind of were able to satisfy that by partnering with someone who had more industry knowledge in the space, right? Like JP. So how did you guys end up meeting? And was that something you were aware of? Like, this is someone that obviously knows deeply about, this space, that we could kind of have this good synergy.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I definitely borrowed all of that from him, right? That's why he was a co-founder, not an employee. He was bringing all of this industry connection, passion, knowledge, the way it all worked, right? And so we actually met as freshmen at Notre Dame. I started a band, and he was the first member. He was the guitarist. And so from 18 years old till now, he's actually visiting from Ecuador right now. He's staying with me. We've been really good friends. And so even back then, when he was 18, 19, 20 years old, he would talk about how he's going to move back to Ecuador someday and run a flower farm. It was his passion and his dream as a teenager. And we were just like, you're so weird. Like, let's go try to get a fake ID, right? Like, it was like, why are you talking about this when you're at this age? But that was genuinely his life's dream. And so it was not a thing that I really thought much about over the course of the next 15, 20 years until we started talking about it in the context of the business that he was running. He had moved back. He was running a flower farm, and he was seeing these inefficiencies in the supply chain. And he's like, hey, look, you work at an e-commerce startup. Like, is anything you're learning there applicable to us? And it was more of just like hey, can we chit chat about this? And then over time that evolved into, yes, this solution should exist. Why does it not? Maybe we could build it, right? And that was sort of the natural evolution of the conversation.
I'm curious. Did getting your MBA help you more than it or hurt you to be a founder? Because there are all these, we always hear these narratives of like, should you get your MBA? Is getting an MBA good or bad for starting a business? Because you learn all these business things, but sometimes the naivete helps, when getting started. So I'm just curious for you, like, would you say that it helped you?
It absolutely helped. I mean, I think that the reason MBAs get a bad rap sort of in the startup ecosystem is that a lot of the curriculum isn't directly applicable, right? You're learning how to do finance for a Fortune 500 company, not for a company with 3 people that's going to go out of business in a week, right? But what I found was, one, those 2 years were super formative for me in figuring out that eventually I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I tried to start a business while I was there as the first time because I had the freedom, the time. I was living on loans. I had like class for 3 or 4 hours a day, and then I had all this time, which you don't ever have, right? Once you get a job, you have a family, there's this freedom to explore and try things was really great. But then, I sort of advise and work with a lot of founders, and I've worked with folks who have undergrad degrees in business, those that don't, those that have MBAs, those that don't. And, consistently I see those that don't have that advanced degree struggling more with the basics. How do I build a financial forecast? I don't know anything about Excel. And like, they'll figure it out, right? But the level of inefficiency is high because they haven't had the exposure before. So net on the margin, would I prefer for a founder to have it? Yes. But is that like the thing that makes it work? No, absolutely not. Like, clearly, right? Because those that are really driven and just smart enough to figure things out find ways to complement the skills that they're lacking through people or process, whatever it might be, right? So same exact founder. If I had the choice, yes, I'd love for them to MBA. Do you need one to start a company and be successful? Absolutely not.
So ultimately, you obviously you guys launched Bouqs. What was it, and obviously what has it become since that point? Has it changed much?
Yeah, so our thesis was, this supply chain in floral, this $18 billion market in the US, has about 6 layers in it: farmers, importers, wholesalers, florists, order gatherers. And they're all sharing the value chain. And the thesis was, could that value chain be a lot more efficient if it was all under a single roof rather than have all these disparate players buying and reselling the product, right? It's a tale as old as time in business. The the idea that we had was, let's deploy technology at farms around the world and let the technology really make the market rather than having this buying and reselling take place. And then let's route those orders to the farms for direct ship to the customer. At the time, we positioned the whole thing around this volcano, which is where all of our farms were located. It's called Cayambe outside of Quito, Ecuador, which is where my co-founder is from. And that was the initial thesis. It's not that dramatically different today. It's just much larger and way more complex, right? Sort of at the beginning, we started with 3 farms. Now we work with 50 farms around the world that ship 2 billion stems a year plus. The supply chain is sort of the same way that we envisioned it, but we have more nodes of distribution as well, right? We have distribution nodes across the country. We have a store here in Los Angeles. It's our first store. There'll be more stores coming soon. So call it the level of complexity of the ecosystem has gotten bigger, but the same thesis applies, which is, let's let the software do the heavy lifting around what flowers should be where and when, so that the customer gets something fresher, fully transparently sourced from sustainable farms, and we eliminate all the waste. And that has largely proven true. And we built a pretty big business on the back of that, on that thesis.
Yeah. So when looking at the entire, puzzle, I guess, you look at the supply chain. Why did you decide to go direct to consumer from the beginning versus just going B2B and like trying to solve at least the sourcing and all that kind of stuff, but having like your distribution be, was it because you felt like there was a missing brand? I know you mentioned like there wasn't like an industry leading brand. Was that the primary driver of that, or was there another reason?
Yeah, that was a big part of it, was this belief that you could build something that stood for something more than just sort of cheap prices in the category. Generally, it's viewed as a commoditized product, so you end up competing on promotional deals, right? That's like sort of what the industry has been for a long time. I fundamentally just didn't believe in that, especially coming from Disney, where brand can have so much power. So the question was like, can we create reasons to buy that aren't price? Sustainability, quality, freshness, accuracy, all these things. Storytelling around the volcano. And the answer to that unequivocally is yes. We've got wildly loyal customers who will spend thousands upon thousands of dollars with us over the course of their lifetime. So we proved that out. That was probably the biggest reason why. The second was, it was what I knew, right? Coming from Disney, branded consumer experiences is where I came from. So I was automatically biased towards that solution. It's something that I found interesting and wanted to work on. If you had said like, hey, the better solution here, John, is to build a wholesale machine that does X, Y, and Z, I could have maybe gotten there, but I wasn't going to lean there at first. Right? The fun part for me was create the brand from scratch, get the pictures of the volcano, talk to people about how the volcano erupted and what does that mean for you as a consumer. That was all the fun stuff for me.
Yeah. And you talk about like incumbents like 1-800-Flowers, and that's obviously something important to consider when you're starting a business. Like, who's in the industry right now, and are they doing a good job at it, or what's kind of missing? Like, what was the approach with you that you thought, we'd come in from a different angle and like try to capture the market this way? Like, what was the consumer behavior that you saw or tried to kind of unlock that, wasn't being met or serviced by like a company like 1-800-Flowers?
Yeah, I mean, we did a decent amount of consumer research, nothing super sophisticated because we had no money at the time. But we spent a lot of time looking at review sites and just looking at customer satisfaction in general in the industry. We ordered a bunch of times from kind of everyone and said, like, what's the experience versus my expectation? And we just reviewed every single page of every single site. And what we came down to was, there's a way that this industry kind of works, right? Whether it's 1-800-Flowers, Etsy, Teleflora, a million other websites that there are in this category, because there's almost no barriers to entry to being a order gatherer for florists. It's pretty easy to get into that space. So there's lots of places to look. And we saw a couple things that were very consistent. Everything was discounted all the time. Like, there was no such thing as a full price. There was always discounts. But the price that was advertised was never the checkout price. And it was typically like 2x. So if it was advertised at $80 on sale for $50, when you check out, it's 93 or whatever.
Why is that?
Right. Because that's the way the funnels all worked, because someone somewhere optimized those funnels and said, this is the best way to get the maximum value out of a customer. Right. And so across all these websites,
isn't that like a classic bait and switch? Like that doesn't make much sense.
That's absolutely what we called it. We were like, don't fall for the bait and switch. Right. But you saw it across all of these websites. It was very standard. So we said, we're getting a price in an ad. We're not paying that price. We don't like that. We're ordering pink tulips. We're getting yellow sunflowers. We don't like that. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't like that. And we just started effectively building our brand around all the things that we didn't like and giving the opposite. So we started our business. There was one price, $40. No upsells, no other things you could buy. You could buy one size, and every single thing was $40. Why? Because everyone else had 1,000 options with 50 upsells and lots of different pricing structures and fees. And we said, free shipping, no shipping charges ever, right? A lot of these things have changed over time, but the core insight of let's just make it simple and easy hasn't gone away. We have a lot more selection now. We started with 40 bouquets. Now we've got probably 100, 120. We had one size. Now we have three sizes, because over time we heard from customers like, that's the regular size isn't big enough for me. Like, I want to go big here, man. It's Valentine's Day for my girl. Like, I want to go triple, right? So we have the grand size for those that want to go really big. So we evolved the business over time, but what we felt like was there was an opportunity to sort of take the way things were done. And because it was so sort of homogeneous across what we saw for the competitors in the industry, we felt like there's an opportunity here to actually stand out, where we don't need to have big marketing budgets. And that worked really well. The first couple of years of the business, we grew to multi-million dollars of revenue with no marketing budget. We didn't have the cash in the bank to do it.
So how are people finding out about it early on? Like, what was the biggest driver of customer acquisition?
It was almost all word of mouth in the first year. 2013 was people ordering, posting on social media, talking about it. This was so good. Look at how long they lasted. They're so beautiful. You can see the stamp from Ecuador to show that it came actually from Ecuador, right? A cool user experience that people talked about. And then in 2014, I went on Shark Tank. And that was sort of the next big leg. Was Shark Tank was the gift that still keeps on giving to this day, 10 years later, 8 years later, I guess. But really a big sort of stamp on the business, even though we didn't get a deal on the show. Being on the show, especially back in 2014, was a really big deal. And that definitely put us on the map for consumers in a big way.
So, John, I know it's been several years, obviously, that you guys have been running the business and it's still going strong. I think it was mid 2020 where I don't want to say take a step back, but you no longer were the CEO. I think you just kind of took on that founder chairman role. I have a specific question and a general question tied to that. One, when did you know that it was time to kind of take a step back and become the chairman versus CEO day to day? And then on the general question side is, when should founders take a step back? Or should they at all?
Yep.
So I'm just curious to hear your insight there.
Yeah, for sure. So, there's no one size fits all in this for sure. It's very personal and it's very dependent on the type of company and the type of founder. When we started the business, call it 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, it was the perfect job for me, right? I was good at it. I loved it. I was having the most fun I've ever had professionally. When we started to get bigger was where it started to become less fun for me, right? 2016, 17, we were now crossing into like the 50, 60 people kind of range of employees.
And you're talking bigger in terms of number of people or revenue?
Both, all of the above. The revenue necessitated a lot more people, so we're scaling people, but primarily around people, right? The early days, that sort of first 3 to 4 years, it's 10, 15, 20 people, pretty small team. And I grew up in an industry where you worked on small teams. Bain Company, our teams were like 3 to 10 people. At Disney, I managed a team of 3, and our entire org was 50, right?
From small cities to small teams.
Small cities to small teams, right? And so when we started getting up into like the 40s and 50s, the job changed pretty dramatically, right? It went from the job primarily being about getting everyone to believe and being a catalyst for creativity to a job about managing process and people management, team growth, all these things that, one, I'd never really been asked to do in my career because that's not where my experience came from. But two, I learned pretty quickly that I didn't like it.
Right.
And people tend to spend time doing things they love. right? I had spent all my time dabbling in creative pursuits. That's where I'm great. I
Right.
wasn't great at that, and I didn't have fun with it. And I remember distinctly, I think it was 2017, it might have been 2018. We got my board and I agreed that I should get an executive coach to be the best CEO I could be. And really great guy. Spent a lot of time with him. But the first thing we did, the very first
Had
thing
he ever been a CEO?
I don't believe so. I don't believe he was a former CEO.
That's what I thought.
But they had this clear rubric that was they used with like all these great founders and CEOs that have scaled companies, et cetera, that had the 8 things that they believed you have to be great at to be a great CEO. These 8 things. And I went down that list and was like, hate it, don't like it, I guess I'll deal with it. I like that one, terrible at it, don't want to do it, boring. Like I looked at the whole list and I was like, if this is a CEO job, I don't want to do it. Like this is not what I want to spend my time on. I spent the next sort of year, 2 years trying to learn to want to do that job. And then in 2018, I recognized like, nope, this isn't what I want to do. Now, looking back on it now, there's lots of different types of CEOs, and some are great at those 8 things, and some are terrible at those 8 things. I'm not saying you have to be great at those 8 things, but it was a really sort of a moment where I took to reflect on what I wanted to spend my time doing. And I didn't want to spend my time doing those things. And for better or for worse, our company needed those things. We needed structure. We needed process. We needed a really organized team sort of dynamic. Like that's not what I want to spend my time doing. I wanted to come up with new technologies to solve new problems. And so, we got to a place where I went to the board in 2018 and said, hey, I'm kind of ready to make a change here, but the business wasn't. And we all agreed, like the business was not ready. And so it was like, hey, put this on the shelf for now. Let's get the business to a place where it's ready. It took us about 12, 18 months from that point where we got to a scale and a team around me that could sort of handle that transition. Right. And that's when we really started going out in earnest, and looking for an executive to join me to sort of run the company from there on.
Did you enjoy working with the board? I mean, you're a founder. Like, did you need a board?
We needed a board because we needed money. And no one was going to give us $80 million without taking some level of operational control. Some people can get away from that, right? If you're the founders of Snap, you can do a lot of things because you're the founders of Snap. That wasn't us. Right. And so, look, I'm really good friends personally and professionally with a couple of my board members. We've had a formal board since 2014 when we closed our Series A. There's pros and cons to any of it, right? It's great to have a check on your conscience, on your gut whenever you're building a business, especially at some scale. It's really helpful. It's great to have connections into their networks to help out. At the same time, it's harder to make decisions, right? Now, no longer is it point and shoot. I'm going this way for sure, guys. It's let's talk about this thing. Let's see what we can do. And so it definitely changes the dynamic a lot. But I always definitely stress with founders, especially in today's culture, everyone just sort of goes immediately to, I have to raise a ton of money, right? Like everyone goes straight there because it's been so glorified in the press and like, look at this round and it's so much money and all this stuff. But I pressure test with a lot of founders like, look, if you have to, sure, go raise money, but understand what it comes with and what it prevents. If you get to $10 million of revenue, your company's worth $30 million and you raised money at $20 million a year ago, pre-money valuation, you ain't selling. You might own 80% of it. You ain't selling. You could get rich. You ain't selling. And so really understand what you're trying to build. If you want a 10 to 15 year journey, if you're going for a 500 million plus exit, raise money. If you're thinking I'll build this thing to 5, 10, 15 million and sell it, don't raise money. Or if you do, raise it from like your uncle's friend who is a doctor who's got an extra 100,000 laying around and not the VC, so that you can maintain that level of flexibility and control in case that's what you want to do. And if you don't know, don't take money. Take your time, figure out what you're building towards. It also might turn out that the only way you can build the company you envision is to take money, which was the case with us. I thought we could do it bootstrapped. I got a year in. I had one developer. He was working forever, just not stopping. The poor guy was just grinding away. And I was like, I need 6 more developers, and I can't afford it, right? So it was a necessity for us to be able to build what we're going to build, but it's definitely a point of focus for me when I advise founders in the class that I teach. It's a really key decision point that everyone's faced with.
Yeah. And then, so I saw I think after you stepped down, you kind of, went to the other side of the fence and became an investor yourself. And sounds like you're kind of investing in certain startups in the seed stage. What's kind of been your approach there? What are you looking for typically? And what are you most excited about?
Yeah, so we have a pretty broad thesis around sort of the pandemic and post-pandemic world and kind of underserved markets in general. I put underserved in quotes for a reason. The pandemic changed everything, as we all know, but the amount of sophisticated...
What's the pandemic? Sorry.
What's the pandemic? Sorry, it's this thing. It really changed the way people think about living and working, and it's sort of an unprecedented wave of sophisticated engineering and technology talent leaving certain places and going to everywhere, right? This was already happening as universities have invested more and more in entrepreneurship and engineering and software programming. Pockets of talent have sort of started to be everywhere, but there's still like a gravitational pull to New York and San Francisco primarily. But on the back of COVID, this distribution of that talent paired with satellite campuses for Amazon and Apple and all the sort of mega tech firms is creating pockets of talent that were never there before. And they're going to start starting companies in those places because they just bought a house in the suburbs of Austin or in Raleigh, Durham, or wherever they went to.
So do you think there's still pockets? They're just micro pockets, or are they just fully dispersed at this point?
There's definitely still pockets. There's more concentration in some places than others. But our thesis is primarily that over the next 20 years, you're going to see as much innovation coming out of everywhere else as you're seeing in the major hubs. Right now, we're not there yet. But as a whole, you take all the other sort of tier 2 cities, in quotes again, you're going to see some major companies coming out of there at a pace that you haven't in the past because of this influx of talent due to the pandemic. And then the underserved part is really a thesis around value, right? Like everyone's been chasing companies. I've watched pre-money valuations go crazy. We raised our first round of capital back in 2014, our Series A, at a fraction of what similar companies today raise. And part of that is just, it's been 9 years, so time has passed, certainly, but also just the amount of money chasing the best companies has increased dramatically as well. So we see an opportunity to get in at more reasonable pre-money. Now, the market's also taking care of some of this as well, but even versus that, more reasonable pre-money. And when you look at outcomes for venture capital funds, a lot of it is driven by the pre-money valuation you get. And so those are sort of the overlapping sort of 2 key pieces of what we're doing. It's still technology investing. It's still seed stage, early stage. We do everything except for sort of hardcore biotech or cannabis, those types of things. But anything that is software or software enabled is really interesting for us. And so that general trend is really what I'm most excited about. But I think the hardest part about it is predicting and understanding where we are on the curve, right? How quickly is it going to happen from here is really anybody's guess. We want to be sort of one of the earliest and first to be on that train, and certainly others have been there before us. But we're excited about what that's going to bring over the next 10, 20 years.
What's your favorite flower?
My favorite flower is the gilly flower, which is also known as a carnation. Okay. The carnation gets this bad rap because it's like, the flower everyone gave to their teacher in 1982, right? Where it's like cheap. Yep. But there are some amazing colors and sort of combinations of carnations, and they last for freaking ever. Like you can give it to your mom, your sister, your wife, and it'll be there 3 weeks later. It's one of the best values from a price perspective. The brand of it really just got crushed in the 80s, and that's sort of the core problem. But we've brought it back in some interesting ways with Bouqs, and they always tend to be, really good sellers. So it's not the fanciest of flowers, but I think it's the best.
Interesting. I like it.
Yeah. Well, John, this has been so much fun just, chatting with you and learning your story and kind of, everything that comes with building this amazing company that you've built, and, excited to see what comes next for you, just whether it's for Bouqs or investing or what have you, and looking forward to keeping in touch.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. And check us out at Bouqs.com, Bouqs.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn, John Tabis, Tabis. Appreciate it, guys.
Love it. Thanks, John.